Hello Kerbalnauts and welcome back. This week we're going to be looking at getting a Kerbal to the Moon and back again. This is a major milestone, so if you've been following the tutorials up to this point, this is going to be a big payoff. If you've paid attention to everything I've taught you up to this point, and you pay attention to what I teach you in this lesson, you should be able to hop over to the Moon and back without any problems at all. So first of all, let's gather a little bit more information about our destination. If we go to the tracking station here, you can see we've got our little satellite in orbit over here, and we have the Moon. Double click on the Moon to focus on it, and you see these two buttons here. The I button will give you a little bit of flavour text about the Moon, and this button here will tell you about some of the physical characteristics. So there's a lot of important information here. Equatorial radius gives you the size of the object, mass of you gives you how much of it there is, ASL gravity gives you its gravity relative to Kerbin. So you can see here that it has a little bit under 1/10 of the gravity of Kerbin, well, a little bit over 1/10 of the gravity of Kerbin. So any object on the Moon will have 1/10 of the weight of any object on Kerbin, assuming that they both have the same mass. So remember, mass is how much of an object there is. Weight is how much force is being put on that object by gravity. Therefore, mass doesn't change, but weight does. Why is this important? Thrust to weight ratios. It means that an engine putting out a very small amount of thrust will catapult you sky high on the Moon, even if on Kerbin it wouldn't even get you on the ground on exactly that same rocket design. So it means we can get away with a lot less fuel and a lot smaller engines in order to be able to escape from the Moon, whereas with Kerbin we need big engines and lots of fuel. The other important thing to consider is this, the SOI, the sphere of influence. Now, what's that? Well, in real life, gravity affects everything, and everything is affected by the gravity of everything else. So, whilst you're sitting here at your computer, Mars is actually affecting you very, very slightly with its gravity. However, Mars is so small and so far away that the effect that it has on you is so tiny it practically doesn't exist. On the other hand, for spaceships, this is quite an important consideration. So let's say in real life you were trying to get a spaceship to Mars. You'd need to consider the impact that the Earth's gravity would have, the impact that the Sun's gravity would have, the impact that the Martian gravity would have. If it's passing anywhere near the Moon, then the Moon's gravity is going to have an impact on it. But the Moon's gravity and the Moon and the Earth are so close together that the gravity of both is going to be having a significant impact on the rocket at the same time. It's a mathematical nightmare. Simulating all of that in a computer game, while possible, is a lot more trouble than it's worth. Squad have got around this by using what they call sphere of influence. Your rockets are only ever affected by one object's gravity at a time, and that object is the smallest sphere of influence that you currently reside in. So the sphere influence of, say, Kerbin, or Kerbal, I think it's called, yeah, Kerbal, is huge. SOI infinity. You cannot get out of the Sun's sphere of influence. But if that's the case, why is it that the rocket that we launch is always behaving relative to Kerbin? Well, it's because Kerbin's sphere of influence is a lot smaller. Kerbin's sphere of influence is only 84,000 kilometers. But that's still further than the Moon, which has an altitude of 11 million meters. Do the math conversion yourself. Sorry, I'm being a bit lazy here. But essentially, you can see here that the sphere of influence of Kerbin extends at least as far as Minmus. However, the Moon's sphere of influence is a lot smaller. Therefore, once we get into the Moon's sphere of influence, we stop being influenced by Kerbin and instead start being influenced by the Moon. So what does all this gibberish mean? What is the practical effect at the end of the day? It means that if we want to get to the Moon, we need to get within 2,430 kilometers of it. If we can do that, then we get captured by the Moon's gravity, and the rest of it is just a matter of correction. So it's a pretty big target to hit. Now, are there any other considerations that we need to look at here? Well, there's the inclination of the Moon. If you look here, you see it's very level. Minmus, on the other hand, as you can see, not so much. It's got a very diagonal sort of orbit. If we move to the side here, you can see that where the Moon is quite steady, Minmus is very erratic. Now, we'll cover reaching Minmus another time, because reaching Minmus requires another set of challenges, but the basic skills can be honed by reaching the Moon first. Some people say that you should aim for Minmus first because the delta V requirements to do a return trip is a lot smaller, but there are more concepts that you need to be aware of in order to be able to reach it, such as correcting the inclination of your orbit. As such, I'm going to stick with the Moon because it's a logical progression. It expands on the basic concepts that we've put in so far. It's a much easier target to hit because it has a very large sphere of influence, so that's why I'm sending you to the Moon, even though some people say that if you're learning the game, the better first stop is Minmus. Okay, so let's get out of here and let's go into the vehicle design bay. So let's start from the very beginning. When you're planning a mission, you work backwards. Now remember, your rocket separates from the bottom upwards, which means that the higher you go with the rocket, the further up the rocket staging you are, the closer you are to home. So as such, you want to, because these rockets are designed by necessity from the top down, because the command pod is the first thing you put in, we have to plan backwards. So if we look on our delta V map, the first thing that we need to do is get from low Kerbin orbit back down onto Kerbin, which requires between 4.5 and 4.7 thousand delta V. That's a huge amount of thrust, but fortunately we don't need to land using our engines. Because of the fact that Kerbin has a nice thick atmosphere, we can, under the Utilities tab, put a little Mark 16 parachute on there, and that's completely sufficient. Beneath that, we put a stack decoupler. Now, why a stack decoupler here? Well, the parachute can only be effective for so much weight. The heavier the object is, the faster it's going to be going, and we'd either need to put more parachutes on or risk an unsafe velocity. So by putting the stack decoupler here, we ensure that we eject absolutely everything possible off the rocket, minimum possible weight, so the parachute can give us the most effect. This does, however, mean that when we separate this stage, we need to ensure that this pod is actually on a return course to Kerbin. Otherwise, it has no engines, it has no way to correct its course, and, well, the poor little pilot is going to be marooned. So beneath that, we're going to put the advanced SAS module. Now, why not put the advanced SAS module up here? Because, as I say, by the time we separate this pod, it should already be on course, and we therefore shouldn't need to make any more maneuvers, and therefore we shouldn't need the SAS. So we can get rid of that dead weight and make sure, again, the parachute is as effective as possible. The next stage of the trip is from the lunar surface back into low Kerbin orbit, or at least the Kerbin intercept. Now, in theory, you want one stage for every maneuver, because that means you can ditch the weight, and therefore the next stage is going to be more effective. Each maneuver should, in theory, then have just enough power to actually get you through it. In reality, that usually means you're putting a lot more engines on your ship, and if you're putting a lot more engines on your ship, you're increasing the weight. So what I normally do is group all the stages into a logical cluster. So for example, I'm not going to go have one stage for ascent to a low Kerbin orbit, have another stage to ascend to geostationary transfer orbit, another stage to ascend to Kerbin Moon transfer orbit, another stage to put us into low Moon orbit, another stage for landing, another stage to get back up, another stage to... You're just carrying so much crap and it's not worth it. So what I'm doing is grouping everything together. Working backwards then, the next stage, or stage cluster if you will, is to return from the surface of the Moon back to Kerbin. So again, using your delta V chart, total up all the costs. So it's 640 delta V, 201, 190 and 670 equals 1701 delta V. So if this module that we're putting on now has 1701 delta V, that will be sufficient to get it from the surface of the Moon back to Kerbin without going through any extra stages. And to me that's quite logical. It can all be done in a single burn, in fact. So because it's all being done in a single manoeuvre, it also makes sense to have the lander only as one stage. So let's stick a fuel tank on here. We'll start with this one, the T200, nice and small, and the LV909 engine. We're also obviously going to need something that gives us a delta V feed out. Now I've decided to switch to using this Kerbal engineering system over MechJeb, partly because I don't want to start annoying and alienating the hardcore gamers who insist that MechJeb is the devil. They're wrong, but we'll entertain them. But also because it actually gives a bit more useful information as well. It can give you the stats in the atmosphere separately, which is quite nice, because obviously in an atmosphere your engine's ISP is a bit different. MechJeb does that, but it gives you all the stats at once, so I find this a lot easier to read. But also it can give you your reference to different bodies. So you remember me saying that on the Moon you'd have about 1/10 the weight, therefore that means you should have roughly 10 times the thrust to weight ratio as you would on Kerbin. And if we click on, see here, we have a thrust to weight ratio of 1.91, on the Moon 11.48, so roughly 10 times. So that means even with this tiny engine we're getting a huge amount of thrust to weight, far more than we'd ever get on Kerbin. More importantly, we've met our delta V requirement. So if we then put some landing struts on it, so utility, we're going to go with these LT1s. I find the LT5s are just too they're matchsticks, they break. The LVT2s, whilst nice and beefy, are a lot heavier. And remember, more weight means less delta V. So if we put these about there. I know when these are deployed, they're about the height of one of these engines. We then also need, obviously, a ladder. So we're going to go with the slightly longer one. Reduce down the lines of symmetry to 0 and use the Tellus LV. Don't worry about it being too long, these clip, so you don't have to worry about that. But we are now reduced our delta V down below the point where it's actually going to be useful. Now bear in mind that these delta V charts tend to be quite conservative on their estimates, so you want to be going over the delta V and certainly not under it. So right now, with more efficient manoeuvring, this thing can still probably get from the Moon's surface all the way back to Kerbin, but I wouldn't want to risk it. So we're still going to need all these parts, so let's just take them off for now. And it's stuck. I have to ditch that one. So let's get rid of this fuel tank and put a slightly bigger fuel tank on. The FLT 400. And you can see, that gives us plenty of delta V. So we'll put the ladder back on. Get a good view to make sure that it gets to the bottom. So put that about there. And then if we use one of the standard non-retractable ladders, that should give us the rest of the way. So we know now that looking at the side on, that's definitely going to be okay. We want to make sure the Kerbals can get in and out, because if they can't land, plant the flag and then get back on, what's the point in going? Again, 4 lines of symmetry. It's playing silly buggers. There we go. So that's 2,642 delta V. That's way over what we need for our return trip. That's about 1,000 delta V too much. But the next stage, or rather the previous stage if you're working chronologically, requires 841 delta V. And that is from lunar injection to landing. So from entering the Moon's sphere of influence to being able to land requires 841 delta V. So that means currently this lander currently has enough delta V to put itself into low lunar orbit, land, and then take off and return to Kerbin. It's got enough delta V to do all of that. So those two stages essentially are now sorted. The only thing missing, a couple of solar panels just to make sure that we've got some power to this poor little thing. Actually, let's put some bigger ones on there. We've got enough delta V to spare. Let's put these two on. And you can see we still have plenty of delta V. So 841 plus 1701, let's round that 841 up to 1000 just to be safe, and we're still way over what we need. And like I say, having spare delta V is not a bad idea. So let's launch and test this lander. Now, with these landers, ideally you want them short and wide, because that makes them stable. The points where the feet collide should be as low down as possible, so the engine is as low down as possible, so the centre of mass is as low down as possible. The lower everything is, the better. Because of that, what I might do is put these solar panels a bit further down. We can see how much of an impact that'll have. So let's deploy the ladder. And just deploy everything, make sure nothing's clipping. You can then right click on the crew hatch. Left click. Go either. Press F to grab the ladder. We're just checking to make sure our little Kerbal can get off the ladder okay. Press space to let go. You hold down shift to run. Go back to the ladder, press F to grab it. Climb back up. Transition from the ladders here might cause him a bit of bother. No, he's fine. Okay, so we know this design works. Okay, so let's end flight, vehicle assembly building. Let's see what we can do to lower the centre of mass. So if we look at the centre of mass here, if we take these off, does it have much of an impact? No, not really. But we can put them further down anyway. Anything's better than nothing. And because they're the long ones, they're not going to clip into these landing struts. So let's get rid of these markers for now. Okay, so Kerbin landing is handled by the parachute. From the Munna surface to Kerbin, and from Munna injection to landing on the Munna surface can all be handled by this. We've got enough delta V for that. And of course we have enough of the thrust to weight ratio in order to ensure that the thing can accelerate. So the next stage is from low Kerbin orbit to the Moon, and that requires 860 delta V. So let's stick another stack separator onto the bottom of the ship, and we're at the point now where we're going to need a fair bit more fuel, because we're going to be carrying a lot of what we call dead weight now. Dead weight is essentially what you get when you have parts of the ship that aren't doing anything to propel the ship at that time. So when we put a stage below here, this stage won't be firing. So that stage not only has to do all the work to lift itself, but also to lift the stage above it. So this is where you start needing to get where you start needing to worry about engines with more thrust to maintain a thrust to weight ratio. So let's put one of the T800s on there. And beneath that, let's put one of the we'll use one of these because it's got thrust vectoring. LVT45 thrust vectoring will help keep us on track. So again, put the staging in so that what's gone on here? I see, yep. I need to put this up there. You can see that this responds to this stack decoupler by hovering over it. So that fixes that staging. And we want this to go there. So that's that decoupler coupled with that engine, and this engine then fires. Okay, so stage one. Oop. I've buggered that up, so if I press Ctrl Z I can undo. So if we take that off. Now I've never been able to figure out why, but a lot of the time these delta V things start to go a little bit haywire when you add stages beneath them. So just remember what's there and you should be fine. See, for some reason it's now added a considerable amount of delta V. I'm not sure if it's accounting for the fact that, you know, it might now be much higher up and therefore have less atmospheric density or something, but I don't know. I've never been able to work that out. So this stage now has 1,800 delta V, which is about 1,000 delta V, well, just under 1,000 delta V more than we need. So we could reduce the size of this fuel tank, or we could do what we did with this stage and try and combine two stages together. So for example, we could use this as the basis not only to get into a lunar transfer orbit and therefore take us to the Moon, but it can also form part of our ascent stage from the surface to low Kerbal orbit. I think that could be quite a good idea. I think that could work quite nicely. I'm going to try separating out this staging a little bit and see if it has an effect on the delta V things. No, it doesn't. Oh well, worth a check. Again, always experiment. Kerbal Space Program encourages you to experiment. So if we take off that and add another fuel tank, we're going to go with the idea of being able to use this as part of the ascent as well. Put that there. 2,800. So if we combine 4,700 with 800, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, we're looking at about 1,500. So 5,500 delta V. If we can get this stage up to 5,500 delta V, we'll have enough power to not only get the rocket into low Kerbal orbit, but also to be able to get it into a transfer orbit as well. So structural, let's put some radial decouplers on this. Let's say 6 lines of symmetry. We're going to go for the max. You can't get 8 lines of symmetry on these smaller parts. That's reserved for the larger ones. We'll put these low down. That way when they separate, if you also put the actual tank quite high on them, about there, it means when they separate they blossom out like a flower, and you can accelerate out through them, so you're less likely to collide. So we're looking for raw power here, so we're going to put the LVT-30s on there. Now let's combine these into one stage, so all 7 of these engines fire at once. Okay, so you can see here now that stage 3 gives us 2,990 meters per second, stage 2 4,850 meters per second, but as I said, that can get a little bit fuzzy when you start adding stages beneath it. I've never really quite been able to work out what's going on there. So if I take these off, see that's 2,800, I can then put them back on, 2,900, so we're about at what we want, but there is a way we can increase efficiency here, and that is fuel ducts. What we can do is called crossfeed. This basically means that these engines fuel themselves and fuel that engine. So when this stage is finished and separates out, these 2 fuel tanks are still full. Now we're going to cover that in more detail another time, but suffice to say what this essentially means is that where we need the highest thrust to weight ratio, i.e. lower down in the atmosphere while we're accelerating, we get it. And then once we're done, these engines fall away and we lower our thrust to weight ratio, but the thrust to weight ratio doesn't need to be as high now, so it's a slightly more efficient ascent and you have more fuel left in the higher stages than you otherwise would. So you lower your thrust to weight ratio as you need to reduce it, and in doing so you conserve your fuel for higher altitudes and for further along in the rocket's launch. A much more efficient way of doing it still is called asparagus staging, where these tanks are jettisoned in pairs and then eventually leave the central core, but that's a little bit more complicated than what we need at the moment. But suffice to say, we should have plenty of delta V now to get to the Moon. So we're going to call this craft Moonshot 1. Give it the once over, make sure it looks fine. And she does. Staging, let's check staging. 5 and 1 there, so that's all of those, that's fine. All these engines fire off. We then get rid of the boosters once they run out of fuel. This middle engine here then takes over, but it's already firing. That should be enough to get us into low curb in orbit. Once we're in low curb in orbit, we can then use whatever fuel we've got left here to propel us to the Moon. Once we're in the Moon, we separate this stage here. This lander should be able to land on the Moon and then return. Brilliant, everything we need. The only thing we're missing, control surfaces for the advanced SAS. So I'm just going to use standard canards, 4 lines of symmetry, and I'll put them here. Ideally I'd want to put them lower down. In fact I am going to put them lower down. I'm going to move the fuel lines so they're like that. As ideally you want these as close to your thrust as possible. So put that there. If these once these have run out and ejected, they shouldn't go up because they don't have any thrust of their own, and we've got thrust here, so they shouldn't hit these canards. Okay, let's save the rocket and launch.